I was a Marine. I joined the Marines at the age of 17, 1963. So I'm number 18 of 21 kids, so I passed by the Marine recruiting office and I saw this sign that said, "The few, the proud." I wasn't too interested in the proud, but the few I could go for. So, but I joined the Marines, like I say, at the age of 17. I was one of those high school dropouts, and life was going nowhere, so I needed to change of direction. So the Marine Corps offered that to me. I was, after I finished my basic training in San Diego, I was one of those guys. My permanent duty station was Kaneohe Bay, Hawaii. So I had the best of the good life. Was a Marine, paradise, everything was great. I was with 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, and when the fighting began to pick up, of course we sent advisors over early on, and they were there for quite a number of years before the ground troops actually went in. When the president, of course it was Johnson by then, Kennedy was assassinated while I was at Camp Pendleton waiting to go to Hawaii. But Johnson decided to send the ground forces in to Vietnam. The 4th Marines was chosen to be the tip of the spear. Part of our regiment was sent into Vietnam in March of '65. 1st Battalion was sent to Okinawa, Japan for Raider training. So we were a little later getting there. Our Raider training was cut short. They sent us on to Vietnam. We landed, we made the first beach landing that the United States military was involved in since the Korean War. So we were supposed to be highly decorated, and a lot of good things supposed to happen, a lot of bragging right things that was supposed to be ours as soon as we waded ashore there at Chu Lai. May the 8th of 1965, or May the 7th, excuse me, the other time 1-4 landed was May the 8th, but that was in '68, I think. So 1-4 made 2 beach landings. We were in the first one, May the 7th of 1965. Recon had come back that night and told us that there were like 8 battalions of hardcore VC in the area, so we were all prepared to die. It's World War II. You know, they had all the statistics. The average life expectancy of a Marine rifleman on a beach landing was 45 seconds, so we were a little anxious. But 8 o'clock that morning, we went ashore on the Amtraks. By the time we got to shore, they had the big streamer set up. It said, "The Vietnamese people welcome 1-4." No shots fired. Of course, the Army was there. The Army advisors were there, and of course, you know how they're always trying to grandstand. Okay. But they had the Army advisors that were there. They had a little sign they made up. They had it scribbled on cardboard, and it said, "Welcome, Marines. The United States Army is here, and the situation is well in hand." It took the Marines 10 more years to clean that mess up. But I spent about the next 4 months there. Our position was to protect the area for the Seabees while they came in and built the Chu Lai airstrip. Of course, after that was done, then the Marines turned that over to the Army, and we moved on up to up to the demilitarized zone. But before that happened, I was, as we were on patrol, and one of our guests that's here tonight was not introduced, but is a good buddy of mine. He was with me in Hawaii. We made the landing together, He was one of our squad leaders. Ed Paulus is sitting right here. He lives in Carlsbad, so I wanted to recognize him. But on patrol on August 31st of 1965, I was walking point, came into a minefield, and things happened. The mine exploded. Out of that explosion, there were 3 of us that lost both of our legs. There were 2 that were killed, and of course, I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with Jimmy Mitchell. Went to school here, and but he was my lieutenant. He was killed in that explosion. So, for me, the war ended that day. Of course, although it went on, like I say, another 10 years before it finally wrapped up, but after that explosion, then my life changed. From there, I was in a recovery mode. I was in a position that the war, I couldn't think about it for a little while. So as I was just trying to stay alive, the corpsman, of course, another one of our corpsmen is here. A lot of Delta Company guys here today. We could start our own unit, couldn't we? Doc Greeno right here, and of course this was my nurse in the hospital. But Doc Greeno was at Oakland when I got back to Oakland. But I'll tell you a little story, and then I'll skip on back to where I'm coming from. He was one of my corpsmen at the hospital in Oakland. From there, he went FMF, means Fleet Marine Force. He was a corpsman with Delta Company, sent to Vietnam. He was also wounded in action in Vietnam. So that's a pretty interesting story in itself. But from the time I was injured, they treated me at the battalion medical station, sent me out to the hospital ship, which is sitting right out in the bay. I spent 3 days there. They put me on a helicopter to go to Da Nang, somewhere out in the wilderness. The chopper I was on went down. They were able to bring out another helicopter, pick us up, take us on into Da Nang. Spent 3 days there. The night before I left there, the hospital was hit by mortar fire. There was several casualties there, but they got me out and sent me to the Philippines for a little while. Then a couple of weeks back to the United States. So this is where life began to really get interesting, because the country was really beginning to polarize. There was a group that was supporting the troops, supporting the war, but the majority began to, or the ones you heard from, began to turn against the war. And at that time, it was altogether different than it is today. Today, there are people that are against the war, but yet they're still trying their best to support the troops. At that time, those that were against the war were against the troops also. So as they flew us back in from the Philippines, Japan, wherever we were at, they brought us into Travis Air Force Base. And from there, they bused us down to Oakland, to the Navy Hospital. And of course, those of you familiar with California, you know where Berkeley is located. Of course, that was the heart of the war protest. And of course, I remember as they put us on those buses, I was on a stretcher. I was tied down. I had IVs all over me, and they were just trying to keep me alive at the time. But as they brought the bus out the gate, protesters were lined up, throwing baggies of human waste, yelling baby killers, things like that. But things worked pretty good when we got down to Oakland. Of course, Sandy wasn't there yet, but she came a little bit later. But we had some good-looking nurses. Of course, I'd been away from home for over 2 years now, so so I noticed things like that.
Every one of you did. You weren't alone.
And of course, trying to uphold a Marine tradition. but no, the Navy took excellent care of us. We had the top-notch medical teams. Like I say, Sandy came a little while after I was there. Greeno was there, and of course there were other cute young nurses too, and a few old ugly corpsmen. But everything was going well. My main concern at that point, in what, 2 minutes? Is that what it is? Okay, so we're going to wrap it up. My main concern was just trying to get better. Of course, then as I got better, finally the Marine liaison officer came, and of course we had a colonel that was there that was amputee, and he was going to get to stay in the Marine Corps. He had one leg off below his knee, and that was pretty unusual in those days for someone that had been injured to be able to stay in with a serious injury. So he was going to get to stay in. So I talked to him and said, try to get him to pull some strings to keep me in, and it's just not going to happen. So anyway, long story short, the doctor, he saw I was starting to get depressed. He prescribed bourbon for me. It helped me sleep. Of course, I'm still only 19. I'm still not old enough to drink. But one of the guys that was injured with me, his wife would come up every day, and I had her to stop by the liquor store and bring me some bourbon. And I wouldn't recommend that to everybody, but they kind of let me do, I guess, pretty much what I wanted to do. I was among the first severely injured individuals back from Vietnam. So nobody knew what to do with me. They still don't. But I started getting depressed, and it just, I used the bourbon, at nighttime and the daytime, and but then something really interesting happened that changed my life again. One day I woke up, and a couple of good-looking young girls came on the ward. Well, turned out that one of those little ladies was Connie. 6 months later, we were married. And in June, we'll be married 40 years. So, got out of the hospital, attended college, worked several different jobs, did the PTSD thing before it was popular, I didn't get to enjoy it much. I just did I worked for one job for a little while and changed jobs, but eventually, I graduated from college. Connie and I started a business doing the handicap driving and transportation equipment, and we ran that business for 18 years. We retired. Connie told me that she wanted me to write some notes about some of the things that was going on in my head for the grandchildren. So anyway, it turned out to be a book. And some of you already have purchased that book. My banker thanks you. But I think it's interesting. It's not so much about the war itself as probably the effect that it had on me personally and on my family and different things. So I appreciate the opportunity of being here. And when it's Q&A time, I'll be glad to answer any question. If I don't know answers, I can make them up. But thank you so much. Appreciate your attention.
I came into the Navy under the Nurse Corps Candidate Program in 1964. And under that program, they paid my last year in college at the University of Michigan. And I owed the Navy 2 years of active duty. And I had never been further west. I was born and raised in Pennsylvania. I'd never been further west than Ann Arbor, Michigan. So on my dream sheet, I put down I wanted to go to, I think, Bremerton, Washington, Oakland. No, Oakland was my first choice because of San Francisco. Oakland and then San Diego, and I guess I put Bremerton, Washington down. And I was fortunate enough to get Oakland. So I reported into the Naval Hospital there in September 19th or 20th of 1965. and a brand new graduate from a 4-year baccalaureate program. Now, Michigan had a lot more clinical experience than some of the collegiate programs, other collegiate programs in nursing at the time, or even today. So I was comfortable with my basic clinical skills. And we had a 6-week orientation. Mine, they asked me where I wanted to work. I said pediatrics. And they said no. And I said, okay. Orthopedics. I had done my senior team leading on an orthopedic floor in Ann Arbor. So they said, okay, we need you. So I was on a basic orthopedic ward. And then, but we took a report, change of shift report, in the supervisor's office, which was on the amputee ward. So every day I had to walk through there. And it scared me to death. I thought, I don't know if I can, these guys are wounded in Vietnam. And that it was a challenge enough on the other ward. But after 6 weeks, the supervisor said to me, and this is kind of the story of my Navy career, we think you should work up on the amputee ward. And I said, well, I don't think I should. But I didn't have any say-so in the matter. That was all there was to it. And I survived. Thanks to the guys. They kept me going, and they were a challenge. But I was intimidated. I was scared. Was I going to say the right thing? Was I going to say the wrong thing? And I did say the wrong thing. Some of the stories I can't repeat. One of them I can. Denny Duello, who was on the ward at the same time that Ed, I was helping him with his bath one morning, and he had these neat freckles. I said, you have got the most unusual freckles I've ever seen. I've never seen anybody with gray freckles. And he looked at me and he said, what did he say, Ray? 10 powder burns. And I was just mortified. I'm blushing now as I tell the story. But I mean, that was what I was scared of. But the thing that was most important was to give the guys the best care that I could. And that's what I tried to do. And they were so glad to be home. They had survived. They were alive, that they were a handful. And maybe during Q&A, Ed will tell you some of the stories about them. They were allowed to have the can of beer at night so they could sleep. And I'm sure when Dr. Salisbury wrote the order, he meant, an 8-ounce or what, normal. And so they would go down or have somebody go down, and they came back with the giant economy-sized cans of beer. So I learned an awful lot from taking care of the fellows then. I really did. From the 2 years at Oakland, then I went to Guam for 18 months, and again was on an 80-bed orthopedic ward there. And because of my expertise, once they found out, that also became the amputee ward there on Guam. Not as many. The ward at Oakland was 20 beds on one side, 20 beds on the other, and they were all full of amputees, with 1 or 2 exceptions, because we were considered the dirty ward. That meant that everybody was infected. They all came to us infected because they'd been wounded by and large in rice paddies or in an unclean, nasty environment. And then after the 18 months at Guam, I came back to Camp Pendleton for 4 months. And that was when what was going on in the war finally hit me. We got medevacs in one night, and a fellow came in with relatively minor injuries compared to what I had been used to for the last 3.5 years. He had multiple shrapnel wounds. And when I got home, I burst into tears, and I thought, this is, it's time for, it's getting to me. And I was fortunate enough to get a call from the detailer with an offer to go to San Francisco to recruiting duty. And the office was in downtown San Francisco, and that's when I was called a baby killer and a few other things, because I wore my dress blues, started to wear my dress blues back and forth to work. I lived in the city and would take the bus. But I quickly wore a civilian raincoat and left my cover at work so I wouldn't be exposed to that on a daily basis. And that was very difficult because I was anything but a killer. I never carried a gun. I don't know how to shoot a gun. I wouldn't know which end. No, I probably could figure that out. But so that was a different side of Vietnam that I had not been exposed to before. And I know that some of the women that I have met through the years who were in the Army particularly, the director of the Nurse Corps did something very, very astute in 1965, 66, and 67. She dictated that no Navy Nurse Corps officer would be assigned to the hospital ships or in country in Da Nang until they had had at least one tour stateside. So we had exposure, and the ward that Ed was on, 76B, became an orientation area for a lot of the nurses that were assigned to the Repose and to the Sanctuary. When I got to Oak Knoll in September of 65, we had no hospital in Da Nang. We had no hospital ships deployed off the coast. Some of Ed's compatriots came in with their stumps were taken care of, but they still had their battlefield dressings on their minor wounds. So it was really an overwhelming experience for a young nurse. But what I was starting to say was that the Army, unlike what the Navy director did, Captain Bolshevsky, the Army nurses would come in, as I had, through the Army candidate program. They had the same thing. They would go to their boot camp indoctrination, and then they would go to Vietnam. And I met several at the dedication of the Vietnam Women's Memorial in 1993 who never told anybody they'd been in the Army in Vietnam until the Women's Memorial was dedicated. There's a video, part of the publicity for the statue, and this woman is a dentist, and she was a nurse in the Army, and her husband didn't even know until the statue was dedicated, because of the way some of us were treated when we came back. I think one of the things that helped me was writing the article for the Reader's Digest, and I stayed in for 26 years, and I did a lot of talking on recruiting duty. I did a lot of speeches to Kiwanis clubs, Rotary clubs, because of the article, and that was my catharsis. I think that's why I didn't have post-traumatic stress, and survived and still have a sense of humor about it all. One of the great rewards was getting back and seeing Ed. Today's the first time that we've seen each other in 40 years, and the same with Jim. It's really neat to see how well, what I call my boys, and they're now men, how well they're doing, and what a tremendous life they've made for themselves. I was fortunate to run into two other patients from Guam in 1993. Tim is a bilateral AK, the same as Ed, and Bill lost one leg. And Tim, much like Ed, has his own business. His goal was to make enough money and sell the business before he turned 45, and he accomplished that by the age of 40. And he can do anything. He can put up fences. Ed's built a tree house. There's nothing that they can't do. And I think that was one of the most valuable, the two lessons I learned from taking care of the Marines. And one of them was, there's not a thing you can't do once you set your mind to it. And the other thing was tough love. And the tough love stood me in good stead about 3 years ago when our son hit some real rough spots in his life. And my husband and I had to say, this isn't the way we brought you up. There's the door. And when you only have one son, one child, that was very difficult to do. But I'm grateful to my Marines because that's where I learned it. That's what I had to do as their nurse. And Tim's story was that he fell out of his wheelchair. Remember those old high back wheelchairs? Those old rickety things? These are a piece of cake compared to that, yeah.
Makes you proud to be in it.
Yeah. But anyway, this was on Guam, and Tim had finally earned permission to go to the movies. And in transferring from his bed to the wheelchair, he fell on the floor. And he wanted me to help him back in this wheelchair. And I said, you're a Marine. You can get back in that wheelchair yourself if you want to go to the movies. That's not what he says I said. And you can sit there all night if you want to, but I'm not going to help you. So I left, and it took him, he swore a lot. The air was pretty blue. But he got himself back into that wheelchair. And that, he says, is the turning point. He said, I saved his life because he was ready to give up. He was that low at that point in time. But that's what we had to do. And that was probably one of the hardest things, because you just hear these fellows who have been in combat and you just want to pick them up and hold them and love them and hug them and just, but I couldn't do that. So I really learned more from them, I think, than I ever could. You know, they thank me, but it's mutual. It's mutual. So, thanks.
I'm Ray from, I was raised in Huntington Beach, California. Some of you might have heard of it. And when I was, my parents are Hispanic. Both of them were born in Mexico. And there's about 8 of us growing up. Kids. Have a brother who was drafted in 1965 into the Army, and he was a crew chief on a helicopter. He was in Vietnam in 1967. I was drafted in 1966, so first draftee here on the panel. So not all of us joined up, okay? When I went by the Marine Recruit Depot, I kind of covered my face and hope they weren't grabbing anybody. So I went to Orange Coast College. A lot of you know where that is, in Costa Mesa, and I got an AA degree. And then when I graduated, it kind of gave me the diploma in one hand and my draft notice in the other. So I graduated in June and was drafted in September. And I went to Oakland for a couple of weeks, then we went to basic training in Fort Hood, Texas. And the guys I was drafted with, a lot of the guys I was drafted with, a couple of them I went to grammar school with. Okay, so I knew one guy from 3rd grade, another guy from 6th grade, another guy. The guys we were all from the same community, from Huntington Beach, Santa Ana, Newport Beach. And we went to Fort Hood, and they put us in a basic training unit. And then they brought in guys that were all drafted together from New York and a few guys from the South, Alabama, Georgia. And they put us together in basic training unit. Then we had advanced infantry training. After that, they kept us together. So we were all together in this TONE unit, what they called. So we haven't got orders for Vietnam. Usually after advanced training, you could be sent off to Vietnam as a replacement. You go as an individual into a unit. Well, I found out, in fact, in one of these classes a while back, that they were doing an experiment with us, which is kind of interesting. We were guinea pigs. So they kept us together, and about, I think around April '67, we started hearing a lot of rumors that our unit was supposed to go to Vietnam. And so some guy came by, and he had been at brigade, and he said that he saw a big banner, like a big flag, like these banners up here. It had a real nice, emblem on it, a flame and a bayonet going out of it, and it's called the 198 Light Infantry Brigade. And I said, wow, what's that? I said, oh, that's you. I said, really? And at that time, the Army, and I think even the Marines, our uniforms were different. Nowadays, they wear, jungle fatigues, and they wear camis and all that like they do in combat. In those days, the only people that wore jungle fatigues were in Vietnam. And the only people that carried M16s, that supposed M14s at that time, '67, was in Vietnam. Marines still carried M14s even then. So they didn't ever say anything to us about, okay, you guys are going to get ready to train and go to Vietnam. They just started issuing us new equipment. They said, oh, you got to go down and get new equipment. So we stand in line getting all this new equipment. We're getting jungle fatigues, jungle boots, our packs we turned in. We got rucksacks made out of nylon and aluminum and all this really cool stuff, And I thought, hey, I think they're trying to tell us something, And a little while later, we turned in all M14s, and everybody got M16s. They started taking us down to the rifle range so we could learn how to use the weapon and stuff like that. So, and a little after that is when we started our training. So we had 3 months of guerrilla warfare training before we actually went to Vietnam, which is more than most units, except for early on. When, at that time, which is '67, they weren't sending units in that much. But there was a big call-up, I think, of about 200,000 of men they wanted in there, so they trained us as a unit. So we went over there on a ship in October of '67. And I remember when I go back a minute, when I was first got my orders to go in to induction to report in. My mother had a cousin whose son had also been drafted, and his mother and family and him, they decided he was going to go to Mexico. And you know, Mexicans don't go to Canada, okay? we don't speak the language. So exactly. So that's really extra funny today, I think. But I had an uncle down there who lived in Mexico City, so I had family down there. It would have been real cool to go down, visit my uncle for a while. But my dad and I sat down and said, you know, that's not right. We can't do that. I mean, we live in this country, and I was born here. Okay, they came over in 1924. And they lived here a long time. I was born in '45, so this is the only country I've ever known. And my brother was already in the Army, and I thought, you know, I can't do that, you know. And besides, if I do go to Mexico and skip out on the draft, somebody else is going to take my place, and I couldn't do that, you know. I mean, the Army has its quotas, right? They got 200 guys, they're going to get 200 guys. If 10 skip out, they'll get 10 more. So somebody's going to take your place. So I decided there's no way I would do that. So anyway, that's something that, you know, we had a good discussion with Mom about that. But, you know, it's just, you know, something that came up. And like the thing with my cousin, to this day, you know, I don't talk to him much anyway because we don't see him now much. But after a few times I did see him after that, it was like a wall between us, a coldness that I think it was more from him, because I was willing to talk to him about anything, but he just really didn't approach me too much except to say hello and things like that. And before that, we've been pretty close. But you know, the war did cause a lot of divisions in families. You know, some were for, some were against, and some didn't. So it was really close to home. So anyway, we got in. I went over to Vietnam on a ship. Right? A lot of guys flew over. We went on a ship. Took 21 days, and we didn't know if we wanted to. What was worse, you know, landing in Vietnam or staying on that ship. We were tired of it. It was, and not only that, halfway over, I had KP. And, you know, you're down in the hold of this ship. We ran into a storm. It's going all over the place. And, you know, we're around all this food. And it was pretty bad. Me and this guy had a bet as to who would get seasick first, because everybody was getting seasick. So we bet $10, you know, and to this day, neither one of us won. You know, neither one of us got seasick, and I guess it was that $10 bet. I don't know what it was. So anyway, like I said, we went over to Vietnam as a unit, and so our unit was really close. Like I said, there were guys in my platoon that I was served in Vietnam all the time I was there, that I went to school with, grammar school with. You know, I met another guy who he became my best man actually. His brother used to drive a truck. My dad was a truck driver, and he hauled sugar beets in Orange County, around Los Alamitos, Irvine, before they built all the houses. There was a lot of agriculture there. And his brother used to drive a truck for his uncles and his dad, and they used to park at my dad's house, because we had empty lots, and they would park their trucks there and stay with us while they hauled sugar beets in the area. And one time I was asking him, because we were out on a range, a rifle range, and his last name was Perez. So I asked him, you know, and he told me he was from Brawley, California. And I said, well, I know people in Brawley, California. I had uncles there and relatives even. And I asked him, do you know a guy named Freddie Perez? And he said, yeah, I know him pretty good. He's my brother. You know? So this was the guy's younger brother. So I said, oh, no wonder. You know, so and I had known him all through basic training, and halfway through AIT, about 4 weeks, we finally started talking about it. So it's a small world, and so these are the guys I went to Vietnam with, okay? And then there were guys from other, like I said, New York and South, and they had grown up together. I met one guy his best friend in Vietnam was a guy I went to high school with, you know, and sadly his friend was killed over there. So, and he took it really hard, and that's why I guess this experiment really didn't work out very good. Because when we lost people, it was very, very hard. And I was in an area where we didn't have a lot of face-to-face contact. Okay, I was in Chu Lai, same as they were. And I guess the Marines scared all of BC away because all they left behind were the booby traps. Okay, so we ran into a lot of mines, we ran into a lot of booby traps, we ran into a lot of snipers, a lot of little face-to-face. Either that or they were afraid of the Army, and the Marines they weren't. You know. Payback time, guys. So it was very, very frustrating because we lost a lot of guys and we didn't ever see the enemy. You know, there was no payback. And that brings me to the point he mentioned about My Lai. My Lai actually happened in April of '68. Okay, and the unit that went into My Lai was the 11th Brigade, which was part of the Americal Division, which we were part of also. We were a little bit north of them, the 198. And I remember an instance, it was I think right after Tet. I was there for Tet of '68. Right after Tet, we had gone out, we lost a lot of guys. My platoon before Tet was, 28 guys. And after about the beginning of February, we were down to 10 guys. And half of those were killed, half were wounded. And we came back to this base camp that we worked out of all the time. And we're driving. This is one time that we got to hike to a road, and they picked us up on trucks and took us back in on trucks. Usually we jump on helicopters and flew back in. So we're driving in these trucks up to the base camp front gate, and we're all standing in this truck, and I'm standing there with my rifle, still loaded, and you know, round in the chamber. It wasn't, you know, unchambered. We didn't do that. And I used to really work with my safety a lot. I always greased it up really good so I could just flick it with my thumb and it would go semi, 2 clicks and it was auto. So, you know, because when you first get the rifle, it's kind of hard. So I made sure it was easy to turn. And I'm standing there in this truck, and we're going up to this gate, and there's all these kids running around and adults, and they're waving at us and welcoming us back. And some of them I recognized because we used to go out to the village and buy stuff from them. And it took everything I had to not turn that rifle on automatic and just spray the whole group. And it was because of the guys we'd lost and the way we lost them. Like you were saying, you know, guerrilla warfare was so different. You didn't know who the enemy was. And it took a lot of strength to not turn into an animal and do ugly things. And I think if you get into a village like My Lai and you're getting fired on from them all the time and you get into that situation and somebody starts shooting and somebody says, do this, you may not think and just do it, you know. So I can't say I wouldn't have done the same thing, but I just hope I wouldn't have, you know. But I can't, you know, throw rocks at the guy that did it because I wasn't there, but I was in a situation very similar in the same zone. And I met a guy when I was in the hospital. I'll get to that in a minute. 2 minutes? Okay. I met a guy in the hospital named Richard, and he was in Callie's platoon, and he had lost both his legs, and he was also blind. They had ran into a minefield the day before they went into the village, and that's how he got wounded. And the day before that, they had lost, I think, 3 or 4 guys because of mines and stuff. So they were not in the right frame of mind to go into that village, and the officers above them should have known that and not let that platoon go in. Because they weren't in a frame of mind where they wanted, like we wanted, payback. And you're going into a free fire zone with this village or whatever, it's, you know, you've been getting fired on from there. You're going to want some payback. So it was not the position they should not have put them in. And that's why I wish they had, you know, court-martialed some of the colonels and stuff like that instead of just the lieutenant. But yeah, what they did was wrong. I don't agree with what they did, but I can understand how your frame of mind changes. Let's see. After in May of '68, I was wounded. I think you all got a paper about that, and that paper I wrote, Tours in, it was not the kind of tour. Like he was saying, that is a bad word. I didn't think about it, but it is a bad word. And yeah, exactly. I'm going to have to talk to my, what do you call it, the travel agent or something. Yeah. Tour guide, yeah. But I came back to the hospital, and because I was wounded, I stepped on a landmine, lost both of my legs, one above the knee, one below. And my squad leader was killed at the same time. And the thing that bothered me about it the most up to recently was his death. more than my own wounding. I could deal with that after a while. I do pretty good with my artificial leg and getting on pretty good. I went back to school, got a BA in graphic communications, involved in a lot of volunteer work with Point Man Ministries and church and things like that, a group called Amputees in Motion. So I'd done a lot of things, but losing my squad leader was the hardest part, because he was laying right in front of me and I just had to watch him die and I couldn't do a thing. And when I was wounded, we were just out there without any medic or anything. And I had to wait at least an hour. I don't know how long it was. It's just hard to tell time when you're like that. Just with nothing. No morphine, nothing. There was nobody there but me. And 4 other guys, 2 of them were wounded. And one had been there 4 months, one had been there 4 days. And I had to tell them what to do as far as first aid so I could stay alive. And so it was very difficult because I just had nothing for over an hour. So anyway, that was my tour. And also, one more thing I'd like to say is that, maybe as you can see from my sharing, it's very difficult to sometimes share what happened to us, because we just given you a little snapshot of it, but when we remember it, we remember the whole picture. Like when I talk about people, I remember their voices, their laughter, everything. So it's very hard. But at the same time, it helps us to share and to talk about things. So that's why I'm here. I'm just glad to be here. Thank you.